the it's a miracle, or it's an experience that's told in all four Gospels. When Mary anointed Jesus' feet with the fragrant, it was spikenard. This is frankincense. If you've been shopping for essential oils, you'll know that frankincense is one of the most expensive ones. It's one of the gifts that was given to Jesus, so it seemed fitting for me to use it. And I'm going to pass this around. If you want to smell and have it with you, that's okay. But it'll get all the way back around by the time we get to the end. But you should sniff it. You see, Jesus said while she was washing his feet, that this story needs to be told wherever the gospel is shared. Now, did you ever wonder why this story needs to be shared wherever the gospel is shared? Well, think about it. When she opened that fragrant and washed Jesus' feet, everybody in the room smelled it. The blessing was there for everyone. Now that's a parable and a symbol. When Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price for everyone's sin. Everyone who has ever lived, Jesus covered it. Now, some people were blessed by the fragrance of that ointment that Mary broke on Jesus. But many in that room refused the blessing. See the parallel. Just as at the cross, Jesus paid the price for your sin, and the question is, will it make any difference for you, or will you refuse it? So if you're one of those who really wants to take a bunch of notes, I can tell you the chapters. Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 7, and John 12. Every gospel writer recognized that this story needs to be told. We're going to look at the several individuals who were at that feast. Now, the feast was a feast at Simon's house, Simon the leper. You've been around Bible stories enough that you should recognize in Jesus' day, leprosy was considered the finger of God. That you were being condemned for a sin. When we get to the end, you'll recognize, at least on a human level, why Simon should have recognized why he got this finger. But Jesus had healed him. Now, what does it mean when Jesus heals you? It also means that God forgives you. Yes, he deserved that finger of God, but so do we. But he has been forgiven. A perhaps more dramatic thing, this is happening in Bethany. Who lives in Bethany? Mary, Martha, Lazarus. Lazarus has been raised from the dead. So Simon, Lazarus' uncle, is giving this feast because he's thanking Jesus for having healed him from his leprosy. Lazarus is also there. In fact, to some people, Lazarus is the star attraction. Well, he was dead for 4 days, and now he's alive. There are people who want to see and say, what was it like when you were dead? And he would tell them, I was asleep. The Greek dualistic philosophy had even invaded Jerusalem and Judea and Bethany, and people were thinking that when you're dead, you must see some glories of the hereafter. And Lazarus said, nothing. I didn't see anything like that. I was dead. I was asleep. So Lazarus was there, and in fact, You find John 12, verses 9 and 10. Oh. I want to read it because it's pretty potent. Great many of the Jews knew that Jesus was there, and they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom Jesus has raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also. Isn't it just absolutely shocking? Rather than trusting the miracle worker, they're going to try to get rid of the miracle. They were ready to kill Lazarus. I don't know how that story ended out. I really don't know what happened to Lazarus. I have some ideas. But they were plotting to kill Lazarus because they knew that even after they'd killed Jesus, and they were already planning to kill Jesus, they knew that they would have to get Lazarus out of the picture or else the story would come back up. Martha was there. I need to mention Martha. She's mentioned in at least one of the gospel accounts. What was Martha doing? Serving. You know, she's Martha. She serves. Every church needs its Martha. We need them. But we also need to protect them so that we don't overload them with serving and don't give them opportunity to also worship. Martha was there. Judas was there. The whole set of disciples were there, including Judas. I mention Judas particularly because the story mentions Judas. It started with him. You need to have somewhat, are you done with this? Somewhat of an idea of how they ate their meals in that day and time. We're so used to chairs that we think that's the way it is. You just sit up at the table in your chair. But if you've traveled to the east, two of my two oldest daughters have served as missionaries in the east. India, Laos, now Karen's at Papua New Guinea. People don't sit in chairs much. They generally sit on the floor, and the table, if they use a table, oftentimes they just spread a cloth on the ground to put the food on. But if they use a table, it's just a little short table, and people sit around it, often cross-legged. But in Jesus' day, for formal meals, you recline on your left elbow. Sorry, you who are lefties. You recline on your left elbow and you eat with your right hand. And in some cultures today, it would be rude to eat with your left hand. It's still an issue. But so they're laying on their left elbow. Their feet are sticking out behind them while they're at the table where they could eat. Mary thought to do this quietly. She came in very unobtrusively. You know what I'm talking about. Perhaps you've done that. But she didn't think of what's going to happen when I open up this fragrance. And I'm smelling it now in the room that has been passed through the room. It's the frankincense is here. It's really special. Judas, when he smelled the fragrance, and he knew, I mean, he's a businessman. He's clever with money, and he knows that would be a year's wages, 300 pence, a year's wages. She's just wasting a year's wages on Jesus' feet. And so he said it. Why this waste? And it goes around the table. Everybody, nobody says it really loud, but everybody's, what's going on? Look at this waste. He's even Simon, we'll get to him later, started with Judas. Jesus heard it. And Jesus knew how much it would hurt the heart of Mary for what she was doing to be called waste. And Jesus said, leave her alone. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body for burial. Now, we're looking at Judas. We're looking at 5 different people here. And we've got to look at Judas. Jesus has never rebuked Judas for his selfishness or his theft. He has actually stolen from the money purse that he carries, which is supposed to be paying expenses for the disciples and Jesus, and they would use it to help the poor. But he has used it for his own self. Jesus has never confronted him for this. But Jesus, in commending Judas, whom he has criticized, he took that as a rebuke. And the record is, he went from here to betray Jesus. He went and talked to the chief priest, saying, let me make an arrangement with you. Let me get 30 pence instead of that 300 that she had paid for that ointment. Just a paltry sum. How cheap we throw away our eternal life. I need to move to Mary. This is the hardest part. When Mary was a teenager, she has been violated. Now, I'm trying to use very polite words, but this is rape, this is incest. It was her Uncle Simon who had violated her as a teenager. And how people respond to being violated is quite broad. I've talked to too many people, and when somebody has hurt you, and it doesn't have to be sexual, but there's plenty of that going on. I'm sure there's people in this room who have been sexually violated. And truth be told, there's probably perpetrators in this room too. We live in a wicked world. And we have a God who forgives and heals. Mary went from here to the town of Magdala, where she sold herself to all comers. There's something that often happens with any inappropriate sexual sin, that we open ourselves up for demonic oppression or possession. The demons afflicted her. It took 7 times that she came to Jesus to get delivered from her demons. 7 times she had to come for help. Keep coming. When you're needing help from Jesus, keep coming. And he never says, oh, I've forgiven you enough. Just go on and suffer. No, every time you come, he says, I am healing you. I am healing you. I am healing you. I believe that this Mary was the woman who was trapped into an adulterous experience and then brought naked in front of Jesus in the temple and thrown down and said, she deserves to be stoned. And here she is trembling, expecting to be stoned, curling up in a fetal position, trying to hide. Doug Batchelor suggests that she might have had a sheet with her. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us details. Doesn't need to. We all know what it's like to have our sin exposed. And she knew she deserved to be stoned. How did Jesus respond? He could have confronted those accusers and said, you're more guilty than she is. And he could have openly declared what they had done wrong and where they had violated the laws of God. But he didn't. You remember? Knelt down and wrote in the dust with his finger? Or with a brush or a puff. Whatever he wrote was gone. Those who needed to read it, read it. They recognized that they were guilty, and they knew that I don't belong here. And they slunk away until who was left? Children, poor folk, and this poor woman. I can just picture him touching her on the head. She's been just curled up and hiding. Says, "Where are your accusers?" She looks up. She says, "There's nobody." No accusers around. Jesus, in love, says to her, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." That phrase, "go and sin no more," is an empowering phrase. Christ's words, God's words, have creative power. And when he says, "Go and sin no more," she could walk from that place a free woman. When she looked at Jesus, she saw someone, first man she'd ever seen, that didn't look at her with lust. It's a sin of this age, lust. I'm frightened how many people come to church every week and look at pornography during the week. We're in a messed up world, and only God can give us freedom. And don't think it's just the guys. This pornography is very pervasive. She saw someone who could love with sincerity. Now, this is the Mary that's washing his feet. And the Bible says that the ointment went on his head and his feet, and she's washing with her tears also, and then she let her hair down and was drying with her hair. Now, cultures change, okay? You know some Amish folk. Those ladies tend to have long hair, but it's always kept up into the bun. You know what I'm talking about? You've seen the stories of the Middle East where the women are required to have their hair covered with the hijab. In the culture where Jesus was, a woman's hair was let down in the bedroom. For her hair to be let down here was shocking. Now, she needed a towel, and it was the one that was handy, and she's been exposed. She didn't feel like she was doing anything wrong, and she wasn't, because she's pouring out her love to Jesus. But Judas and Simon, looking on, are thinking, how shameful. What's going on? Jesus says to her, she has done what she could. She has anointed my body for burial. She had purchased this ointment, and I can only imagine where she got the money to purchase the ointment. The Bible does not say. It's left for your imagination. But she had earned good money when she was plying her trade. Jesus said that what she did was for his burial. She had purchased this when she heard that Jesus was going to die and be buried. But then she heard the talk that he was going to be crowned as king in Jerusalem. And she wanted to be the first to anoint him as king. And so he's crowned, he's anointed as both king and for his burial. How many times have you taken flowers to somebody's casket and wished that you'd given them to them while they could still smell the roses? Nicodemus, Joseph of Arimathea, taking that body off the cross. Yes, they did what they could. But how much better it would have been to have actually worshipped him while he was still alive. Nicodemus did not admit Jesus as Savior until he saw the fulfillment of what Jesus had said in John 3, when I'm lifted up, I will draw all men to me. That's when Nicodemus recognized. Okay. We've got to look at Simon. A healed and forgiven leper. The healing was an indication of forgiveness. but he has not been dwelling in that forgiveness. He has not allowed it to transform his life. And so he joined with Judas in criticizing Mary. And he knew. So we have in the record, Simon is looking and saying, well, if Jesus was really a prophet, he'd know what kind of woman this is. Jesus was a prophet. Jesus knew what kind of woman this was. Jesus also knew who had led her into that sin. Simon is thinking that if Jesus was really a prophet, he would expose her. But instead, I've turned to Luke 7. Pharisee asked him to eat with him. He went to the Pharisee's house. This is Simon the Pharisee, who was counted as a disciple of Jesus, but has never given his heart to Jesus. 37, a woman of the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus was at the table of the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. Verse 38, she stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and she began to wash his feet with her tears, wiped them with the hair of her head. She kissed his feet and anointed him with the fragrant oil. Now when the Pharisee, Simon, who had invited Jesus, saw this, he spoke to himself. Now he's not saying this out loud, but he's thinking this. This man, if he were a prophet, he would know who and what manner of woman this is. She's a sinner. Jesus, answering his unspoken thought, says to him, don't you love this? Simon, I have a question for you. You can't resist this. Simon, let me talk to you. Oh, sure, I'm listening. Verse 31. There was a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed him 500 denarii. That's 2 years' wages. And the other 50, 2 months' wages. When they neither had anything with which to pay, verse 42, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, Simon, which of them will love him more? Can you see the parallel with Nathan confronting David with David's sin, telling a story and getting David to pass his own sentence, 4 for 1. And David indeed buried 4 sons. Yeah. Simon, which one is going to love him more? Simon answered, verse 43, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. Jesus said, you're right. Jesus could have exposed Simon. But in the quietness of this meeting, Jesus is in the honored seat, the position of honor. And on one side of him is Simon. On the other side of him is Lazarus, who probably knew the story. These things don't get hidden in the family very well. He says to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house and you gave me no water for my feet. What a faux pas. In that culture, when you have a formal feast, the guests, especially the honored guests, have their feet washed. I'll talk about that next week when I get ready for communion service in Blue Water. This could be called preparing for communion service 2 weeks from now here. You didn't wash my feet. But this woman has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. Oh, it gets worse. Verse 45, you gave me no kiss. Now, I know, men don't kiss men in this culture much. But in that culture, the men would kiss. Now, different cultures, different parts of the world, and now I grew up that lip kisses were only between husband and wife. And of course, I started kissing Bonnie before we were married, but but we were making plans. Okay? My maternal grandmother was ready to kiss us on the lips, but we would turn our cheek. We make sure that it lands on the cheek. Babies, you kiss babies on the top of their head. Different cultures. I was in the seminary. A couple of fellows were talking. This one man was saying how his wife, a Brazilian, said, when we go and visit my church family, expect that all of the women in that congregation will expect a hug and a kiss. Okay, that's Brazilian culture. And she says, I expect you to behave yourself and do what they expect. Well, another one of the seminary fellows was there. He says, well, I went on an evangelistic series to Russia, and there the men hug and kiss the men on the lips. Oh, I'm not ready for this. But understand the culture. In the culture where Jesus was, Simon should have acknowledged Jesus with a kiss, but he did not. Why did he not? Because he just wasn't so sure. Yeah, Jesus healed me of leprosy, the finger of God, but the Pharisees are saying they're getting ready to kill him, and I'm not sure I want to be too close to somebody that's going to be strung up on a cross. So he did not give the kiss. But, of course, verse 45, this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. Oh, one more. And this one, you have to understand the culture, because otherwise you would have missed it. You did not anoint my head with oil. This woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. The honored guest at a celebration like this should have been given a cone of wax that was placed on the top of the head, and the heat from your head would melt the wax, and that wax, fragrant wax, would melt and run down through your head. I know. It's not something you're eager to have, melted wax running down your head. But that was the culture. And Simon had not done it. Why? Because he was just a little reticent to identify himself too closely with Jesus. I say to you, verse 47, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Jesus could have exposed Simon. He could have said, you're the perpetrator. You're the scum of the earth. And I've had people who are on the list for sexual deviance. I've had them want to come to church. And in our North American division, we have a rule that, yes, you're welcome to come to church, but we need to sign some papers and follow some little regulations. And I'm so glad that we do that. I'm ready to welcome anybody to church. But those who have been involved in pedophilia, let's put some safeguards into place that it doesn't happen here. Jesus was even more gracious to Simon. He did not tell everybody that he's the perp. Jesus did not expose this to anybody. He just said, Simon, we need to talk. This woman has been forgiven. Are you ready for forgiveness? Jesus confronted him. I use the word salvifically. Jesus confronted him to save him, give him grace, very quietly. Nobody else heard except John knew enough that he could tell the story, and Simon was ready to share the stories. Forgiveness. God is in the forgiving business. I don't know, and I don't need to know what sins you need help with, but He heals. He not only forgives the sin, but more importantly, He heals the sinner so that we can go and sin no more. In His strength, not because we're bold or big, but in His strength. There may be some who want to have a special prayer, and if you want to come forward, The song that's been chosen for the closing hymn is one that we often use for an appeal song, All to Jesus I Surrender. And if there's somebody who wants to come forward and have a special prayer,